The St. Louis Dragons season came to a close in the last episode after losing in the wild card round to the New Orleans Saints, and we've got a pivotal offseason upcoming with some likely major shakeups to the roster on the way. So buckle up. There's going to be a lot to go over today. We'll start things off with our wild card loss against New Orleans, 30-16. An early playoff exit felt a little bit inevitable with this team because the vibes throughout the entire year were pretty off. And once our two best players got hurt in the first quarter of this game, we were a sinking ship from there. Puma Whitlock got hurt in the very first drive, taking a hit from James Houston. He ended up dislocating his ankle, which normally is a multi-week injury, but he would have been able to come back for the divisional round had we won. Chance Matamolo replaced him. He wasn't great. He wasn't horrible, though. Callaghan October, meanwhile, had a very strong game for New Orleans. We were supposed to finally have the Callaghan October versus Puma Whitlock game in the NFL, with both of those guys being college rivals. Injuries prevented them from playing against each other in their first two NFL meetings. We were going to have the battle today until Puma got hurt. And then defensively, Simeon Bonnet had 2 sacks in the first quarter, and then he got hurt, dislocating his shoulder. So we were without our best offensive player and our best defensive player for most of the game. Simeon Bonnet is an interesting talk of discussion because he is a free agent at the end of the year, and he's not the only one. We've got a lot of guys whose contracts are up, Bonnet being the biggest one, but other key players like Jeff Okudah, Griffin Weaver, Owen Popo, DeMore Diggins, Jawan Taylor, Darwin Juskins, and others. We've currently got $116 million to spend, and we're going to have to use it wisely, being that it's going to be harder for us to save money because we've got a lot of big contracts coming up, the biggest one being quarterback Puma Whitlock, who's going to be on the 5th-year option next year, making $62 million. Assuming the Dragons are able to work out an extension with him, he'll be making similar, if not more than that. We're no longer going to have the luxury of our quarterback being on a rookie contract, and that's going to make things harder for us financially to be able to spend money and be as flexible as we wish. So we're going to have to figure out which areas of the team do we really want to prioritize going forward, because we've got a lot of talent to pay. Even after this year, guys like Arturo Modelo, Semasoni Saluni, Cam Lucifer, and others. We're going to have to be wise with who we pay and look to build around Puma Whitlock the right way. I think the offensive and defensive lines were the biggest weaknesses this year, and I think it's pretty apparent that we're going to need to fix the trenches, specifically by getting younger through free agency and the draft. Let's take a look at the league stats for the year. Puma Whitlock barely missing out on the passing yards title, losing to Dak Prescott. He finished 3rd in passing touchdowns behind Dak and Patrick Mahomes. The Dak Prescott discourse is pretty interesting because he won the MVP despite the fact that he's getting a lot older and his ratings are going way down. His play has not regressed in the slightest. Kenneth Walker in Seattle ended up winning the rushing title. Based on how he plays against us, that's not really a surprise. He is a monster. Arturo Modelo led the NFL in receptions and receiving yards pretty convincingly. He could have missed the game and probably still be in first. Dynamite Williams of the Cowboys, meanwhile, led the way in touchdowns. The sacks leader in terms of sacks allowed is ironically the former Dragon Jedrick Wills. Maybe we made a good choice in letting him go. Not that his replacement, Jawan Taylor, was much better, but I guess that makes us feel a little bit better about the signing of Taylor. Micah Parsons led the NFL in sacks, while L'Jarius Sneed led the league in picks. I like to take a look at where we are in terms of X factors around the league. We've now had 4 draft classes of players, and many of the top guys in the league are players who have been drafted in this series. So here's a look at all the current Superstar X Factor players in the database. Notable rookies here include the number 1 pick of the Packers, Dean McKennedy, and then quarterback Marlon Byfield, who was drafted in the 6th round by the New York Jets. It looks like they might finally have their franchise quarterback, and it's someone who you would have at least expected. Here are these current Superstar development players as well. Certainly cool to see our league be implemented with so many talented young players, and a lot of these guys should continue to get better and better. Notable newcomers include Darian Wiseman, the running back of the Ravens, who we passed on for Milan Santa, who only has star development. So we'll see if that decision ultimately comes back to bite us. So with that, let's now find out the results of the NFL playoffs. We've got a lot of simulating to do, being that we're still in the wild card round rather than being farther along like we were over the last 2 years. So let's look at where the playoff bracket currently sits. And in the NFC, we've got some interesting storylines. Atlanta, the number 2 seed, they've been close for a while but haven't been able to get over the hump. They face off against rookie quarterback Tyler Lewin and the Seahawks. Meanwhile, Carolina, the reigning NFC champions, face off against Detroit. In the AFC, we had the Chiefs, Dolphins, Patriots, Chargers, and Jaguars, Ravens. We ended up with some surprising results through the wild card games as we take a look at our final scores. So Seattle makes it tough on Atlanta. The Falcons only win by 2. And meanwhile, Carolina gets by Detroit in another close game. The NFC South, being a gauntlet, has proved to help these teams as all 3 of them move on. And 3 of the final 4 teams in the NFC come from the South. In the AFC, the 2-seeded Chiefs upset by the number 7 seed Miami Dolphins. New England beats the Chargers, while the Ravens beat Jacksonville. That'll bring us into the second round. The AFC matchup I'm most curious about is the Steelers and the Dolphins. Rookie quarterback Ty Pollin leads the number 1 seed Steelers, and they end up getting slaughtered by the Dolphins 17-3. In the NFC, it's all about the NFC South. New Orleans upsets the number 1 seeded Cowboys, while Atlanta squeaks by Carolina in a defensive duel. Callaghan October and the Saints are 1 win away from the Super Bowl, with the Falcons standing in their way. In the AFC, we've got the Patriots and the Dolphins. New England ended up beating Baltimore. So 2 divisional rivalries, and sure enough, Super Bowl 62 will be the Falcons and the Dolphins. The Cinderella run for New Orleans comes to a close. They lose to Atlanta by 3, while the Cinderella run for the Dolphins continues. They upset New England. And so the Falcons and the Dolphins will meet off in the Super Bowl. Desmond Ridder versus Tua Tagovailoa for a Lombardi trophy, just as we all would have expected coming into the year. Let's take a look at the Pro Bowl. The Dragons ended up with 5 players, including Puma Whitlock. He is the QB3 in the NFC. Arturo Modelo, wide receiver 1. Very well deserved. We also had Isaiah Likely, who makes it for a 4th consecutive season. Offensive guard Samandre Mack gets in. Very well deserved. We ended up with nobody on defense, which is a little disappointing, but there weren't really any obvious choices for us defensively, so in that case, I kind of get it. And then Cameron Dicker, the kicker, to think he was almost cut at some point this year. He ends up making the Pro Bowl roster. So those are our 5. That brings us into Super Bowl week. We'll talk about the big game in a second. But first, we've got to go over our players who have gone up in development traits since the end of the year. We'll start on the offensive side of the ball. We only had 1. This was to be expected. It's Arturo Modelo, who has gone up to Superstar X Factor. Being that he led the NFL in receptions and receiving yards, this felt pretty inevitable, but it's nice to see that it is official. And to think, when we drafted Modelo, he only had normal development, but he has made it all the way up to X Factor. For now, I think I'm going to make his ability max security. He's great with the ball in his hands. He's a great route runner, but his hands are the one inconsistent area of his game. I really want to use him towards the middle of the field next year, so we're going to focus all of his superstar abilities there. I did not really expect anybody to go up in terms of their development trait on defense, and boy, was I wrong. We ended up with 3 guys moving up, all of whom are in the secondary. We'll start with Cam Lucifer, who now has superstar development. I didn't see this one coming. He had a good season, but his numbers were pretty much even to last year. He didn't move up then. So I'm a little bit surprised by this one, but I'm not complaining. And Cam Lucifer now has superstar development, but he's not the only corner who moves up to superstar. Demore Diggins has it as well. He moves up in development trait for a 2nd consecutive season. Diggins, of course, is a dynamic ball hawk. His interceptions were cut in half from this year to last year. He only had 3, but it doesn't matter. He moves up again. He's a free agent after this year, so his price tag might have gone up a little bit. Since he's only an 80 overall, we can't give him most of the cool abilities yet, but if we re-sign him and develop him a little bit more, maybe we'll give him the opportunity to. And finally, our first-round rookie, Ryan Nada, moves up to star. And this one really caught me off guard. Nada had a strong rookie year. He led the team in picks with 4. But he also played less than 40% of the defensive snaps. He wasn't a starter for us. He was only a rotational guy. He's definitely going to be a full-time player next year with the flashes he showed. Where he's going to play on the defense, that's to be determined. But he is definitely going to play a lot next season. So 3 guys end up moving up in the secondary. And that doesn't even count Samasoni Saluni, who went up in development trait for winning the stud of the year on defense. So technically, we had 4 defensive backs move up. Let's now take a look at Super Bowl 62, the Falcons and the Dolphins. I think the favorite in this game is very clearly Atlanta. They won the best division in the NFL with 3 teams who won 10 games, and obviously the NFC South has been very successful in the playoffs. The Falcons have one of the best rosters in the game, and they've been so close throughout so many years. Desmond Ridder has obviously been able to lead this team as the starting quarterback, and we'll see if Atlanta can finally get over the hump. Their opponent is the 7th-seeded Miami Dolphins. They lost Tyreek Hill in the offseason. He signed with New Orleans. Of course, we almost had the Tyreek Hill Bowl, had the Saints beaten Atlanta. But they've still got Tua Tagovailoa at quarterback, and they've been able to maintain much of their core despite being in significant cap trouble over the last 3 years. The Dolphins barely snuck into the playoffs as a 7th seed, but the question is, can they keep their Cinderella run moving and upset the Atlanta Falcons, who have been on a warpath this postseason? So let's find out the moment of truth. Drum roll, please. The Super Bowl 62 champion is the Miami Dolphins. They upset the Falcons, winning 28-17. And no, Atlanta cannot get over the hump. Tua Tagovailoa and the Dolphins are Super Bowl champions. Tua only threw the ball 13 times. He was very effective, though, completing 11 passes with 15 yards per attempt. As for Desmond Ridder, he laid an egg in the biggest game of his NFL career. The Dolphins' game plan was to run the ball down Atlanta's throats. Nearly 80% of their plays were runs, which is odd because Atlanta's got a great run defense led by Dexter Lawrence. In the air, it's Oliver Tripp who leads the way, headlined with a 78-yard touchdown. Former first-round tight end Devon with a strong game as well. Defensively, notably, it was Jerome Baker who had 8 tackles and a pick. Jalen Ramsey also with an interception. Jerome Baker ended up winning the Super Bowl MVP. When there's no obvious choice on offense, they always give it to somebody with an interception. So I expected it to be Baker. Based on the numbers, I probably would have leaned Tua. Even though he only had 13 passing plays, he was really effective throughout the duration of the game. And with that, the Dolphins add to the list of champions in this series with Jerome Baker winning the Super Bowl MVP. And with that, we make our way to the offseason, and that starts with retirements. Notable guys here include Taylor Decker, Joe Thuney, DeForest Buckner, Eric Armstead, Brandon Scherf, Ronnie Stanley, Khalil Mack, Jadeveon Clowney, who played a whopping 1 game with the St. Louis Dragons, calls it a career. Mike Evans is done, and then, of course, as we knew from the wild card round, Lane Johnson has retired as well. An interesting omission from this list is Ryan Jensen, who is now 37 years old. Jensen has played really well for us over the last couple of years. I still would have expected him to retire, being that he's really, really old. He is a free agent himself, and while he has played really well for us over the last 3 years, he's also missed 11 games in that stretch, and, well, he's 37 years old. We got to get younger on the offensive line, so there's a good chance we ultimately let him go, and with his age, I'm not sure who's going to be interested in him. Let's now take a look at the coaching changes around the NFL. The Tennessee Titans, after 1 season, will be firing head coach Todd Monken. This will be the 5th head coach over the last 6 years for the Tennessee Titans, who have been an absolute train wreck. Their roster is a disaster. There's a reason why they nearly went 0-17. With the exception of Christian Kennedy, pretty much nobody on this roster, including quarterback Otto Askew, should really be viewed as a long-term building block. With the amount of coaching turmoil this team has gone through over the last few years, understandably, nobody wants this job. Nobody can be stupid enough to take this position, except for the dumbest guy in the NFL. Aaron Rodgers is the head coach at the Tennessee Titans. Is he qualified for this? No. But he's the only guy who wanted the job. So with that, the Titans are forced to hire Aaron Rodgers, who has 0 coaching experience because nobody else wanted the position. The Minnesota Vikings will be hitting the reset button, firing Kevin O'Connell after 6 seasons. I get why Minnesota did this, but I also feel like he was dealt a bad hand, being that their starting quarterback, Deontay Harris, got hurt in the preseason, and this season never really was able to get on track for the Vikings, being that they had to start a 4th-round QB for most of the year. Their roster isn't in horrible shape for the new coach who comes in, but this team certainly needs some retooling, and they probably will be getting a new quarterback this offseason. They'll be hiring Mike McDonald, who's been the head coach over the last 3 years in Cleveland. He now gets an opportunity here in Minnesota. Speaking of Cleveland, they now have a job opening, being that they fired Mike Macdonald. I don't get this move at all for the Browns. They were in really bad shape when they fired Kevin Stefanski and hired Macdonald, and I feel like he did a pretty good job with this team. The Browns were really good over the last 2 years. They obviously took a major step back this year, but I feel like firing him was the wrong call. They want to get somebody to help Dasani Madison's development. Madison, of course, the former number 2 overall pick, is a pretty good player, but the gap between him and Callaghan October, the top pick in his draft, has certainly widened after the great year October had. They'll be going with Pep Hamilton, a well-regarded QB developer. He's worked with guys like Andrew Luck and Justin Herbert, and finally gets a head coaching gig. The Washington Commanders will be getting a new head coach as well. Mike LaFleur is out after 4 seasons with the Commanders. They could be a team who looks for a quarterback as well. Juan Salazar had the best year of his career, but with him entering the last year of his deal, that could be a position they look at. They'll be hiring Dave Ragone. He was previously the offensive coordinator of the Saints. He had been working under the current Saints head coach, Ryan Nielsen, for quite some time. And with him being a big piece of Callaghan October's development this year, he'll get an opportunity in Washington. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers will be firing Ben Johnson after 1 year. Got a feel for Ben Johnson. He's gotten 2 head coaching gigs in this series and has been one and done both times. Just like the Titans, the Bucs will be hiring their 5th coach in 6 years. So again, with the consistent coaching turmoil, nobody really wanted this job, although they are in a little better shape than Tennessee just because their roster isn't as unbearable, but it's still not a good team. They're in a loaded division, so understandably, this wasn't a very popular team to go for. So they'll be going for former Pro Bowl defensive back D'Angelo Hall, who had been working under Ejiro Evero with the rival Carolina Panthers. Last but not least, the New York Giants are done with Brian Daboll after 6 years. The Giants started off really well in the Brian Daboll era, but over the last few years, they haven't been quite as good. Of course, they've got a superbly talented young quarterback in Stanley Cubbage Jr., who will be entering his 3rd season. Cubbage has not put the pieces together, but is a really talented, fun player. And overall, I think this roster is in a lot better shape than some of the other teams we've gone over today. So with that, the Giants are going to be one of the more popular teams in terms of the coaching carousel, and they're going to get one of the better candidates on the board, in my opinion, hiring Brad Idzik. He's a young offensive mind who had been working under Dave Canales for a number of years. This past season, he was the offensive coordinator for Green Bay, working directly with Canales. So that'll bring us into re-signings. The first opportunity to make a true dent into this roster here for the offseason. And obviously, as we mentioned previously, we've got a whole lot of guys we got to pay. Simeon Bonnet being the big one. We've got guys like Okuda, Weaver, Popo, and many other key starters who are not under contract for this upcoming season. We've got $132 million to spend currently, but that number should dwindle quickly, and we have to be mindful with all the guys we've got to pay in the future. Obviously, Puma Whitlock is the big one. He is no longer making pennies, but instead he is on his $62 million 5th-year option, and once he signs his extension, that number should very well go up. Now, there are a few people who have come up with the idea of possibly moving on from Puma Whitlock, and I've got 61 million reasons why that might be a bad idea. As you'll notice here, he only has $1 million of savings and $61 million in the cap penalty if we were to get rid of him as his contract currently stands. So in other words, trading him now financially would be pretty foolish. That's along with the idea of trading a franchise quarterback to begin with, who's just entering his prime at 26 years old, is really not a good idea. And if this was something I was considering even a little bit, I would have tried to play into it here going into the offseason. But I think trading Puma Whitlock would be a really, really bad idea. And I get the injury concern with him because he's missed pretty much 2 consecutive playoff runs in a row. And that's obviously not good, right? But he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He's still pretty young, and he's gotten better on a year-to-year basis this past year, throwing for close to 5,000 yards with 38 touchdowns while being a threat on the ground. You don't find quarterbacks of his talent very often, and I think the whole Puma is injury-prone thing is kind of stupid. If you count the playoffs, he's only missed 4 starts. If you want to throw the wild card game against the Saints in there, he's really missed 5 games over a 4-year span, which really isn't a bad rate. He's played well over 90% of his career games. He stayed healthy the entire year this year before the wild card game. I feel like his injuries have just come at really bad times rather than him being injury prone. Now, the one argument against him is that he's played under 200 pounds his entire career, which I think is a fair criticism. He's only weighed in at around 194 pounds. So what we're going to have him do this offseason is condition. He cannot stay at 194. We're going to have him bulk up, gain ideally 20 to 25 pounds of strength. He's going to improve his injury rating, improve his strength rating, but he's going to lose some of his speed and his lateral quickness. Ultimately, I think this will be better for his health in the long run, even if he loses some explosiveness. The other super big name player on the roster who could be looking for big money is Simeon Bonnet. And like Puma Whitlock, it hasn't exactly been smooth sailing with Bonnet, as he's been very inconsistent throughout his career. And with all these other guys to pay, can you make the argument that paying Bonnet would be the wrong move? Now, as we look at Simeon Bonnet's situation, he's asking for over $30 million a year, which is a lot. We've got a few big defensive players to pay, so we have to be mindful of that. That includes Cam Lucifer. We're going to give him the fifth-year option right now, just so we don't have to worry about that anymore. That's going to take up $15 million. So already, some money is down the bank. But looking at Simeon Bonnet, he's obviously one of the best pass rushers in the league. He's a 98 overall. He's only 25. He's got superstar X factor. The thing is, his career's been a little bit of a roller coaster. He's only really had 2 great seasons, one of which he won the Defensive Player of the Year. This year, he only had 7.5 sacks, but he played his best football down the stretch. Over his last 8 quarters, he's gotten 5 sacks, including 2 in the playoff game against New Orleans before he himself got hurt in the first quarter. He's missed 7 games in his career, so again, he's had his fair share of injuries, but only missing, if you want to count the Saints game, 8 career games over 4 seasons. That's a pretty good rate, and I don't think calling him injury prone would really be fair either. Along with the fact that at his best, he's one of the Defensive Player of the Year candidates on a year-in, year-out basis, I think letting him go would be foolish. Our options would be to extend him, to franchise tag him, or tag and trade him. I think the best decision is to extend him. I think he should be a long-term piece of this organization. 4 years, $160 million. He says yes. We have to overpay a little bit because his morale interest was low. And I get that $40 million is a lot for a non-quarterback. But I think it's worth it for Simeon Bonnet because if we can get him playing like he did in Season 3, he's one of the best defensive players in the entire league. Now, him and Puma Whitlock combined are going to be making around $100 million a year going forward. So that means it's officially time to budget and be smart with our money. Now, lucky for us, we still have $96 million to spend, but we've got a lot of guys to pay. Jeff Okudah is somebody who I assumed we would let go of at the end of the year because we have a really young cornerback room. Okudah had a good season, but he wasn't necessarily marvelous. However, he did miss a couple of games this year, and when he was out, our defense was significantly worse. To be fair, we had some of our other corners out when he was too, so that doesn't help. But we had Door Dashers playing at corner, and it was rough. I think because of that, we need to bring Jeff Okudah back, keep him and Lucifer as the starting outside corners. I think a 2-year deal for him would make sense, so him and Lucifer had the same amount of time left on their current deals, with Lucifer having 1 more year on his rookie deal with the 5th-year option. So Okudah re-signs 2 years, around $35 million. For his level of play, I think it's worth it. He hasn't really taken a step back yet, despite being 29 years old, and I'm confident he'll be able to produce some more. The other super big name on defense is Owen Popo, who played under the franchise tag last year, and his price has gone up, especially now that he has superstar development. I think the biggest thing was how he played at the end of the year. When Devon White got hurt, we needed him to step up, and boy did he. White got injured in Week 16 against Seattle. Popo proceeded to have 15 tackles, 2 for a loss, a sack, a strip sack, which he recovered and took for a touchdown. In Week 17, he had nearly an identical stat line. He was really good in the playoff game against New Orleans. We need to extend Owen Popo. It's the same notion that we had last year. We couldn't agree to an extension then, so we're going to agree to a more player-friendly deal here. 3 years, $39 million. He says yes, he'll be back. We're down to $66 million now, but we have our biggest 3 free agents off the board. That moves us to Griffin Weaver, who's been the slot receiver over the last 4 years. Weaver's a good player. He's a team captain, big-time leader. He is 27 years old, though. As we look at his career, he's a very steady player. You know what you're going to get out of him, but he doesn't necessarily raise the ceiling of the offense. This was the first year he played all 17 games. He's missed 11 games in his NFL career, which is kind of odd because he has a 98 injury rating. He's a very steady and consistent guy, but he's not someone who gives you high-level performances. I think 3 years and around $30 million is fair, but it's not something I want to do right now. We're going to lowball him. He says no. Understandable. With the emergence of Colin Robinson, I think somebody like Griffin Weaver becomes a little bit more expendable. I'm not opposed to re-signing him depending on where his value is in the open market, but for now, we're going to let him walk. That brings us to Demore Diggins. He's been our slot corner over the last few years. He's inconsistent in coverage, but he's a really good ball hawk. For his price of 2 years and around $10 million, that's a bargain. We're going to give him a little more to ensure he resigns. 2 years, $14 million. He's back. So Demore Diggins returns, and the secondary will stay pretty much the same. Trajan Blyshenden has been a rotational pass rusher for us over the last 4 years, and I think the issue with our defensive line is we have too many rotation guys and not enough pure starters with Simeon Bonnet. However, I think Blyshenden is one of our better rotation guys, and because of that, I'd like to bring him back on a short deal, 1 year, $7 million. He will return. Darwin Juskins is an interesting one because he's only a 79 overall, and giving running backs a second contract isn't always a great idea. We did it with DeAndre Swift, though, and I think that decision ultimately paid off. And here with Juskins, I feel like he's gotten better and better throughout his career. When he missed time this year, the offense was clearly worse, in my opinion. And again, for his price, I think bringing him back would be the correct move. I don't want to give him a super long-term deal, especially considering we have Milan Santa developing, and I still think he can be a long-term bell cow running back. But for 2 years and $12 million, that feels like a bargain for a guy like Darwin Juskins, and he says yes, he'll be back. Devontae Wyatt, we gave a 2-year, $14 million deal to a couple off seasons ago, and that decision ended up being a pretty good one. He's been probably our second-best defensive lineman behind Simeon Bonnet. He's back on a 1-year deal and will return to the defensive line. And then the last guy we're going to offer is Presley Harvin, 2-year extension. He returns. Normally in the player re-signing phase, pretty much everybody says no. So I'm surprised we got this lucky. Everybody other than Griffin Weaver accepted, and Weaver was lowballed. So we spent a lot of money here, but ultimately I think it's worth it. We're going to have $37 million left over, and everybody else will hit the open market. The biggest name here, of course, is Griffin Weaver. We're going to keep an eye on him going into free agency, but other notable players we're going to let go include Trenton Simpson, a rotational linebacker who I think is replaceable. Juwan Taylor wasn't all that good this year. Self-explanatory. Tykeem Keon Jr., I think he's still got so much potential, but again, with the emergence of Colin Robinson, he's become our 5th receiver. We have no spot for him on the roster. Malik Hooker, I thought, had a really good season for us, but I want to get younger, and the same can be said with Ryan Jensen. He's a good player, but I want to get younger. DeJuan Overton's 27. I think he's asking for a little too much, and pretty much everybody else here is a depth player, and I think we can get depth guys for cheaper later, whether it's these players or others. Joe Mixon, for example, is a guy who I honestly do want to bring back. I thought Mixon played really well for us at the tail end of the season, but I'd rather spend that money elsewhere and see if we can get him for cheaper down the road. So that's now going to bring us into free agency. The roster looks quite a bit different as we've now got some new holes. We've lost 2 of our key receivers, multiple starters on the offensive line. The O-line looks like a train wreck right now. We have 1, maybe 2 starters in this group. We're definitely going to be addressing the O-line in free agency. And then defensively, as I mentioned, I want pure starters on the defensive line because other than Simeon Bonnet, we really only have rotation players. The O-line and the D-line are the 2 biggest priorities for this team. That's what we need to focus on here going into free agency. So let's take a look at the class, and there are some good players. Jalen Ramsey, Laramie Tunsil, Derek Brown headline the list. It gets worse, though. Griffin Weaver's pretty high up there. He's one of the better young players here, which means he's probably going to have a pretty big market, which means he's going to end up being fairly expensive. With that being said, I think we're going to wait on Weaver, and if we have some leftover money of our $37 million, we'll come back to him. But again, we need to prioritize the offensive and the defensive lines first. We'll start with the O-line, and I think this is a stronger unit in this free agency class compared to the defensive line. There are some pretty good young players across the board here at most of the offensive line positions, and a few guys I'm really, really interested in. We'll start at left tackle. Laramie Tunsil's name pops off the board, but he wants a lot of money, and he's 34. I want to get younger. If we look below him, Sharif Sully, I think, makes a lot more sense. Sully was a former first-round pick out of Texas Tech. He's played with the Cowboys over the last 4 years. He's been a primary starter for them at left tackle over the last 2 years, replacing Tyron Smith, who obviously was with our team for a short time. And he's now hitting the open market, not so much because Dallas didn't want him, but because they did not have enough to pay him. Nonetheless, he's a really good player who's been very good for them over the last 2 years. Now, he's going to cost quite a bit of money. We're going to give him a 2-year, $42 million deal for now. And then the other offensive line I'm super interested in is Martin Llewellyn. He's been a guard for the Texans. They drafted him in the second round, 4-year starter, and he has been lights out every season for them. We're going to overpay him like crazy because I think he is a really, really good player, and we could form one of the best offensive guard duos in the league with him and Samondre Mack. I know it's a big price, 4 years and $72 million. That's a lot of money for a guard. This will make him one of the highest paid players at the position in the NFL, but I think it's worth it. The Texans clearly want to bring him back after not agreeing with a deal for him at the open market. And with these two, we only have $550K left. We have like no money available to spend. Now, luckily, we can still restructure guys. And since we've been flexible with our money in the past, we are able to do this over the next few years. We'll start with Simeon Bonnet. We're going to free up $9.5 million in cap space, and so he'll be making more money in each of the final 3 seasons of his contract. And now we've got a little more wiggle room to spend some money. I'm going to start by upping the offer for Sharif Sully. We're now going to go 4 years and $80 million. I know it's a lot of money, but I think it's worth it. With Martin Llewellyn, we're going to go from 4 years to 5 years and now $90 million. So we're offering $170 million to those two linemen. Since we upped the years for both of them, we actually have even more money to spend now at around $13 million. I want to improve the front seven. I want to improve the pass rush. Malachi Weston is a name who definitely popped off for me. Former second rounder at the Saints, who they ended up cutting. Not so much because he isn't good, but because they have so many guys at his position. He hasn't really gotten a chance to prove himself, and nobody really wanted him. We're going to give him a 1-year prove-it deal for $6.5 million to see if he's actually that bad or not. We're going to do some more restructuring now because there's one more player I really want to offer. So Jamison Williams and Isaiah Likely each have 2 years left on their deal. We're going to backload those contracts so they each get more money in the final year, which again is going to open things up for our final free agent target here in Stage 1, and that's going to be pass rusher DJ Orleans. He was a first-rounder by the Atlanta Falcons back in Season 1, 3-year starter with Atlanta, and his career got off to a jumping start. He had 11.5 sacks in his second year, only 11 sacks combined over the last 2 years, but this season he did have 7.5, and he's been one of the better pass rushers on one of the best pass rushes in the NFL. I don't want to commit a long-term deal to him because his career has been very volatile, like Simeon Bonnet, but 1 year, $13.5 million is a gamble that I'm willing to take with him. We have no money left to spend. Even though we have another offer available, we can only give it to these 4 guys. I don't anticipate we're going to get all of them. Llewellyn in particular, I don't think we're going to land because the Texans really seem to want him back. If we do get all 4 of these guys, great. We can continue to restructure guys, but I don't think that's super likely. If we can land a combination of these 4, I think that would be a win. Now, you may notice, of these offers, Griffin Weaver is not here. It's not that I didn't want him. It's that we just don't have enough money left on the table. Weaver is one of the best young players in this free agency class, so because of that, his market's going to be pretty big, and he's probably going to be off the board in this first stage, meaning that Griffin Weaver's gone. And it's unfortunate. With the emergence of Colin Robinson, though, I'm confident we'll be able to replace him. And Weaver, I think this should benefit him as well. He's going to get a bigger role on a new offense rather than being the 4th guy. So I simulated forward. We only added 1 player, but I see a big chunk of our cap space gone, meaning one of the offensive line signed, and it's Sharif Sully, the left tackle, 4 years, $80 million. We've got our new blindside blocker for Puma Whitlock. It's a lot of money, but I think this guy's got a chance to be really good. He's been a strong starter for Dallas over the last 2 years. He's got superstar development, and he's only 25 years old. There's plenty of room for him to grow. Martin Llewellyn ended up signing with the Texans, 2 years, $28 million. And if you remember, we offered him $90 million. Who is this man's agent? Why is he accepting for $28 million when he had $90 on the table? Now, I get that he would way rather play for the Texans than us, for whatever reason. But how do you pass up $62 million to not live in Missouri? That seems unreasonable. The two defensive players have not signed anywhere. We're going to up the offer for DJ Orleans, and hopefully that will help him accept sooner. It's going to be 1 year and $14 million for him now. We have $15 million available to spend. Now, most of the big free agents are off the board. We don't have enough money for Laramie Tunsil. And again, I want to stay young on the offensive line. With us striking out on Martin Llewellyn because his agent's a friggin' moron, we're going to look at JT Robinson instead, who's not as good, but he's a lot cheaper. Former second rounder of the Eagles, Robinson finally got a full chance to start this year where he played pretty well. For 3 years and $12 million, he's going to be a whole lot cheaper than Martin Llewellyn is. We're also going to look at Bugsy Briggs, who was a second rounder back in Season 1 by the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been a 3-year starter with Cincinnati, where he's been a pretty serviceable player, mostly at left tackle. The idea is that we would slide him over to right tackle with the addition of Sharif Sully. So we're going to give him a 1-year deal for $9 million. I'm not completely sold on him, so it's a prove-it deal, and if it doesn't work out, we can let him walk. So those are going to be our Stage 2 offers. Again, we don't really have a ton of money to spend elsewhere, so we're only going to use 4 of our offers here for this stage. So now we're going to simulate into Stage 3, and I was able to notice that the amount of players that we have on the roster went up quite a bit, and our available cap space went down a lot. This means that all 4 players who we offered ended up signing. DJ Orleans, Malachi Weston, Bugsy Briggs, and JT Robinson are all now with the St. Louis Dragons. 3 new starters on the offensive line and 2 really good defensive players, including DJ Orleans, who I think is good enough to be a full-time starter for us. So with that, the lineup looks a whole lot better. It's still not perfect. Luckily, we had the draft for that. But I think our team is in a much better spot than it was, say, 20 minutes ago. Now, there is still a hole on the roster that I think is pretty noticeable that we still need to address. I've been excited about Colin Robinson, but in case he doesn't work out as the wide receiver 3, we need to have another option. I'm not convinced that's going to be Aaron Mayer. So I looked at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A guy I've been eyeing up as a trade target for a little while is Amarion Cephas, who was a pretty high draft pick a few years ago out of Georgia. The Buccaneers picked him in the 2nd round back in Season 2, and had he fallen a few more picks, I would have ultimately selected him. He was a guy I was really high on, and has turned into a pretty good player so far in Tampa Bay. I think it kind of worked out that we didn't draft him, though, because we ultimately moved down that year in the 2nd round, and we ended up with Samasoni Saluni, and then we drafted a different receiver in the 3rd round. His name was Arturo Modelo. So even though it worked out the first time that we didn't get Amarion Cephas, I would like to get him here because I think he's a really good player, and he's going to be a good replacement for Griffin Weaver. 6 foot, 210 pounds. He can play the slot. He can play outside, and he's really well-rounded. He doesn't really have any major strengths, but he also lacks weaknesses. He's a jack-of-all-trades, master of none type of guy. And it's interesting because the Buccaneers have already replaced him. They signed Griffin Weaver and Tykeem Keon Jr. So they took both of our former receivers, which means they officially have no need for Amarion Cephas, who was already on my trade radar to begin with coming into the episode. And now that they have Weaver and Keon back together, they have no need for Amarion Cephas, whose skill set is pretty similar to that of Griffin Weaver. And the whole reason why I liked the idea of getting Cephas is that I feel like he's a clone of Griffin Weaver, and we'll be able to seamlessly put him back into the offense. The Buccaneers are not going to offer us any trades, which is kind of annoying, so I'm going to have to do this myself. And we kind of have a log jam on the defensive line. As I mentioned earlier, I want less rotation players and more starters. We have a ton of rotational pass rushers. Somebody's got to be the odd man out. and I think that's B.J. Ojulari. He's a good player. He's been a really fun addition for us over the last 2.5 seasons, but we signed him last year to an extension for him to be a starter, and he's not a full-time starter. He's missed some games here and there with injury, but even when he's healthy, he's not a full-time player. He's not good enough against the run. He's not consistent enough as a pass rusher. He only had 1.5 sacks this year. That kind of production, making $13 million, is no bueno. So, because of that, I think moving him is not the worst idea. Cephas is more valuable because he's younger, better, and less expensive, but both of these guys are expiring, so I think it's only going to take a few day 3 picks to get this done. We're going to offer the 119th pick in the 4th round, along with a future 5th, with Ojulari, for Amarian Cephas and a 7th, and the Buccaneers accept. So we add Cephas, who's going to replace Griffin Weaver in the offense, although he's 3 years younger. We lose B.J. Ojulari, but we've already replaced him with a big upgrade in D.J. Orleans. The receiving core now is a 4-headed monster with Jamo, Modelo, Cephas, and Robinson. None of these guys are signed long-term, though. Other than Jamo and Aaron Mayer, who only have 2 years left, the other 3 guys only have 1 year left. So this receiving room could look a lot different. And if Amarian Cephas doesn't work out, we can just let him go at the end of the year. It's not like we gave up a whole lot to begin with, just some day 3 picks and an expiring contract. Here in stage 3 of free agency, we're going to offer some depth players, including Kyle Juszczyk at fullback. We officially have $0 left, which kind of speaks to where we are money-wise. 2 of the 3 players ended up signing, Blake Richardson and then Big Juice. We did not sign Quandre Carabex. He goes to the Steelers, which is kind of unfortunate. I wanted another depth safety because we only have 2 on the roster. I know it looks like we have 3, but we're going to move Ryan Nada to linebacker full-time. That's where he got his snaps last year, and I thought he was really impressive there in the box, making plays with his size. So Ryan Nada is going to be a full-time starter this year. Now, the question is, since we mostly run 2 linebackers in our nickel packages, who's going to start with them? It's been Devon White and Owen Popo patrolling the middle of the field over the last 4 years, but Ryan Nada is replacing one of them. And it's not going to be Owen Popo, because we just extended him. That leaves Devon White as the odd man out, but this was all part of the plan. Going into the offseason, I was looking at trading away Devon White, because he's getting older. He's 30 now. He's not the same player he once was. He's not getting 160 tackles a year. He's not flying around forcing turnovers. He's still good, but he's not as good as he once was. He missed some time this year. Owen Popo came in, and Owen Popo played his best football. Devon White's going to be on the last year of his contract, the 5-year, $75 million extension that we gave him back in Season 1, and I think that contract has ended up being a major win. Devon White's been a great player for us, but I think it's time to move on, and with the development of Ryan Nada, we can afford to do that. I put him in the trade finder, and I was really surprised to see how good these offers are. Now, obviously, I want to be realistic, and most of these offers are complete fleeces. He's a 30-year-old expiring off-ball linebacker. How much can we really get for him? Since he's a good player, I think he absolutely still has value. I think the game's overrating him a little bit. I think the New England Patriots are a good landing spot. I wanted to do him right by sending him to a contender, preferably one in the AFC, and they offered us Christian Gonzalez. They clearly want him. They need linebacker quite a bit, and I was able to come up with a deal that I think is pretty fair. Devon White and the 215th pick in the draft going to New England for pick 93 in the 3rd round, and Bubba Watkins, a 27-year-old run-stopping defensive tackle. I know I said I didn't really want any more rotation guys, and Watkins is a 2-down player. He doesn't really provide anything as a pass rusher. He's more of a run stuffer, but he's really good at his job. He's better than guys like DeJuan Overton and Orlin Babylon, who we've had as run stuffers in the past. 96 block shedding, 98 strength. This guy is an absolute mammoth. He had his first year with a full-time role this season and was pretty good. Showed some flashes, good in the run game. He's not going to put up the big numbers, and he is an expiring contract. I'm not sure if New England views him as a long-term piece. He's 27 years old. He was a really old prospect coming out of Florida State. So I think this is a pretty fair deal. New England's getting the best player in the trade with Devon White. We're getting younger on the defensive line. We're adding a top 100 pick. And both of these guys are expiring. So similarly with the Amarian Cephas trade with Tampa Bay, if it doesn't work, both teams can cut their losses pretty easily. And with that, I like how the roster looks a lot more going into the draft. We've made our receiving room, I would argue, better, despite losing Griffin Weaver and Tykeem Keon. The offensive line and the defensive line are significantly improved. We've lost some stalwarts on both sides of the ball, such as Griffin Weaver, Devon White, and others. But I think it's worth it to go one step back in order to take 2 steps forward. I think for now our team is in a good spot going into the draft. We've got the 23rd pick in the first round, 4 picks in the top 100, although we have pretty much nothing on day 3. We won't pick until round 6, in which we only have 2 picks currently on day 3. But you know me, I like to move up and down the board. So now that our roster is set, what about the rest of the league? It's time to make some trades for the other teams across the NFL, and I've got some big things in mind. We've got some big movers this offseason cycle. So let's take a look at this year's trades. We've got some doozies. We'll start with Saquon Barkley, who is headed to the Carolina Panthers in exchange for a 3rd-round pick. The Panthers need a running back. The Giants don't. They picked Miko Alexander a few years ago, who's a good player. They're getting younger, moving on from Barkley. Tariq Woolen is being traded away from Seattle to New Orleans. The Saints had a high-end corner. Seattle adds some draft picks. Woolen is expiring, and they've got a lot of corners on the roster. The Steelers don't need Pat Freiermuth. They drafted Audley Boozer at tight end a few years ago. He's going to go to the Washington Commanders. The Broncos are really deep in the secondary. They'll be sending Greg Newsome to the Dallas Cowboys, who only have 2 starting caliber players currently at corner. Their secondary now looks really, really nice. Next up, we've got another big one here, and that is going to be Gregory Rousseau going back to the Bills. The Bucs got B.J. Ojulari. Their front seven's pretty good, and the Greg Rousseau signing's been pretty disappointing. He's played his best football in Buffalo. So the Bills figure, why not bring him home where he's looked his best? And they're only going to have to do it for a 3rd and a 5th. And now we're going to end off with a bang. Justin Jefferson is going to the Saints. Minnesota's looking to hit the reset button. They're going to get a lot back. A 1st, a 2nd, a 3rd, and a 4th. Now, I get that Jefferson's value in real life is a lot higher than this, but you got to keep in mind he's 29 years old. He's not 24 anymore. Nonetheless, they're still getting some really good picks, including pick 30 in the first round. New Orleans, meanwhile, has an unbelievable receiving core with Jefferson, Chris Olave, Tyreek Hill, and Raphael Pryor-Swan. That's filthy. Callaghan October has so many guys to throw the ball to as Justin Jefferson returns to the Bayou. Let's wrap things up with the free agency recap. Take a look at some of the signings around the league. You may have already seen some of the big ones, such as Jalen Ramsey to New England. Of course, here are our signings, the notable ones, including Sharif Sully and DJ Orleans. So Ramsey goes to New England on a 1-year deal. He'll pair up with Christian Gonzalez in the secondary. Laramie Tunsil stays in the AFC South, joining the Colts. Derek Brown enters the AFC South. He signs with the Titans. Andre Sisco in Seattle. He's part of the reason why Woolen was a lot more expendable. We talked about Griffin Weaver, of course. Martin Llewellyn, we know, signed for absurdly cheap with the Texans because his agent's stupid. Deacon Adderley to the Jets. So they're not going to rush in the X-Factor quarterback Marlon Byfield, or they don't know what they have in him yet. L'Jarius Sneed signs with the Titans. That's ironic. Jawan Taylor pairs up with Jedrick Wills in Cleveland. That's also ironic. My prayers and condolences are sent out to Dasani Madison. Trenton Simpson stays in the division. He signs with the Seattle Seahawks, so they add to their linebacking core. Deontay Harris will be the new quarterback of the Bucs, and the Vikings replace him with Bryson Bowen. I don't think those 2 teams are excluded from drafting quarterbacks, but both of those guys are going to be placeholders for the time being. Malik Hooker and DeJuan Overton did not end up signing anywhere. If those guys are available for cheap in the preseason, I won't rule out possibly bringing one or both of them back. Hooker in particular, because we need safety depth. We only have 2 on the roster. With Ryan Nada's full-time move to linebacker, it's only Jalen Bourgeois, who's never been a full-time starter, and Samasoni Saluni at the safety spots. So that's going to wrap up the episode. I said that I was going to completely flip this roster, and I didn't lie. We made a lot of big moves. A lot of long-time familiar faces are out the door, and a lot of new faces to help up front on the trenches. Next episode will be our draft preview, followed by the NFL draft in the following episode, where we're going to have more opportunities to shake things up. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.